You've probably heard the term GDP, or gross domestic product, thrown around on the news all the time. It's always mentioned as this huge indicator of how a country is doing, but what does it actually mean? In this explainer, we're going to break down one of the most important numbers in all of economics so you can understand what it is and what it isn't.
So here's how we're going to tackle this. First, we'll get a clear definition of GDP. Then we'll look at how it's actually calculated. After that, we'll dive into what GDP doesn't tell us, which is really important. Then we'll see why it's still used everywhere. And finally, we'll do a quick recap of the key takeaways.
All right, let's start with the absolute basics. You can think of gross domestic product as the standard report card for a country's economy. It's the go-to number to get a quick snapshot of its overall economic health.
Okay, so here's the official textbook definition. It's the total value of all the finished goods and services produced within a country's borders in a specific time frame, which is usually a quarter or a full year. Now, those two words, finished and within, are super important. Finished means we only count the final product, like a brand new car, not the tires and steel that went into it. That way, we don't double count things.
You know, this idea of GDP isn't actually that old. It was first cooked up back in 1937 by an economist named Simon Kuznets. He was trying to help the U.S. Congress figure out just how bad the Great Depression really was. The idea got tweaked a bit during World War II, and it wasn't until 1991 that the United States officially made it the main way it measures the economy.
So that brings up a pretty big question. How on earth do you calculate a single number for an entire country's economy? I mean, it seems like a massive job, right? Well, there's a clear method to the madness. It turns out there are actually three main ways to do it. You've got the expenditure approach, which adds up all the spending. Then there's the income approach, which adds up all the income. And finally, the production approach, which sums up the value of everything made. Now here's the cool part. In a perfect world, all three methods should give you the exact same number.
The method you'll hear about most often is the expenditure approach. It's got this famous formula, C plus G plus I plus NX. Let's break that down. C is for consumption. That's basically all the stuff you and I buy, from groceries to haircuts. G is government spending, like on roads and military salaries. I is for investment, which is what businesses spend on things like new factories or software. And NX stands for net exports, which is just the value of a country's exports minus the value of its imports.
And when you look at how that breaks down, it's pretty eye-opening. For most big economies, like the US, that C component, household spending, is the lion's share of the economy. We're talking about 2/3 of the whole thing. It's a huge driver of economic activity.
Okay, this next part is really important. We have to talk about the difference between nominal GDP and real GDP. Nominal GDP is just the raw number, but real GDP is adjusted for inflation. So think about it like this. If nominal GDP grew by 5%, but prices for everything also went up by 5%, did the country actually produce more stuff? Nope. Real GDP would be zero. And that's exactly why economists and policymakers almost always focus on real GDP. It gives you the true picture of growth.
Now, as useful as GDP is, it is not a perfect measure. Far from it. It's absolutely essential to understand what it doesn't tell us, because the number has some pretty big blind spots.
Let me give you a couple of really stark examples. When a government spends a ton of money on a war, GDP goes up. But that number says nothing about the terrible human cost of that conflict. Or say a company clear-cuts a rainforest and sells the timber. That boosts GDP too, but the number completely ignores the devastating long-term environmental damage.
And the list of what it misses goes on. GDP doesn't count unpaid work, like a parent taking care of a child. It ignores volunteer work. It doesn't capture under-the-table cash jobs. And maybe most importantly, it tells us nothing about inequality. A country's GDP could be soaring, but all that new wealth might only be going to the top 1%. It just doesn't measure things like overall happiness or well-being.
Okay, so you might be thinking, well, if it has all these problems, why do we even use it? That's a great question. And the answer is that despite its flaws, it's still an incredibly useful guide for making some of the biggest decisions in the world.
There's a great analogy for this from two famous economists. They said GDP is like a weather satellite. It can't tell you if it's raining on your specific street corner, but it gives you a fantastic, high-level view of the weather patterns across the whole continent. GDP does the same thing for the economy.
And that big-picture view is absolutely essential. Governments use it to decide on taxes and spending. Businesses use it to figure out when to expand and hire new people. Investors use it to decide where to put their money. And central banks rely on it to keep the economy from overheating or slowing down too much.
And this isn't just some abstract concept. It has very direct, real-world consequences. For example, the technical definition of a recession is usually 2 straight quarters where real GDP shrinks. That one metric can trigger massive policy changes and really shape how we all feel about the economy.
So here's the bottom line. For all its flaws, when GDP is going up, it generally means good things for most people. More jobs, higher wages, healthier businesses. And when it's shrinking, the opposite is usually true, and people start to feel the pinch.
Okay, let's bring it all home. In our final section, we're just going to quickly pull together the most important things to remember about gross domestic product.
So, let's review. First, GDP is the main scorecard for a country's economic output. Second, you can calculate it by adding up consumption, government spending, investment, and net exports. Third, it's a vital tool for making huge economic decisions. Fourth, and this is key, it's an imperfect tool that misses a lot about well-being and sustainability. And finally, always remember that real GDP, the one adjusted for inflation, is the number that truly matters for tracking economic health.
And that leaves us with one last big question to think about. We have this standard, if flawed, way of measuring economic production, but that just highlights a much bigger challenge. If GDP isn't enough, how should we really be measuring a country's success and the actual well-being of its people?